I'm Jeff Campbell from the Forest and Farm Facility here, and it's a great pleasure to invite all of you here. I want to draw special attention to some of our partners from outside of FAO, from the International Family Forestry Alliance. Leonard and Florence, welcome. And to all of you who have come here to listen to John. So John, as you know, is a visiting fellow with us here from Michigan State University. We go back a long way, and he has been really valuable kind of additional part of our team for this period. He's working on a number of products, but we thought we should take advantage of the fact that we have a professor who has done a lot of very interesting research throughout his career and before coming here as well, and now has a better idea of what we're doing, and maybe can talk about a little bit some of the implications that we are always emphasizing and putting a positive spin on getting investment, getting resources, et cetera, et cetera. Are we truly conscious of all of the hidden challenges, maybe even hidden costs sometimes of that? And I know John will expand on these topics. So no further ado, I think the idea is you'll present for
30-40 minutes max.
Yeah, okay. And
Let's
then we'll
discuss.
have a nice time for some informal discussion and inputs.
So thank you everyone for coming. And I was telling Marguerite this morning that maybe a better title of this might have been be careful what you wish for, be careful what you ask for in accessing climate funds. But the other thing is so I'm as Jeff mentioned, I'm a visiting fellow here. One thing I've been working on for the last couple of months with Jose Diaz and Social Forestry is a toolkit around accessing climate change funds. And there's a little piece of that is kind of comes out of my earlier research. And so what I thought I would do, it's not exactly a traditional seminar. I didn't want to give just a presentation of one of my projects, so I'm going to describe one little thing we're working on and use a lot of my past research to illustrate it as a way of trying to be applicable and also giving you an introduction of who I am and what kind of stuff I do. A couple of caveats. One is some of you may be very disappointed. I don't actually know all that much about global climate change funds. Jose probably would tell you that. And I also probably don't really know all that much about FFF. There's a lot of complicated stuff. And really what I'm trying to do is talk about a few general issues that are drawing on my past research around the complexities of development projects, of natural resource management, particularly in cases that require collective action, and research I've done on unexpected and sometimes perverse outcomes in the ways that people respond to financial incentives. And I'm going to refer to a few specific projects I've worked on. One is an evaluation of watershed management projects in India. There are a couple of studies of payment for environmental services projects, one in Mexico, one in China, and a few projects on how people respond to incentives from the US, Mexico, Tanzania, and China. So, just for those of you who aren't familiar with the Forest and Farm Facility, so when they're trying to help, they're helping to strengthen forest and farm producer organizations. And there's four main objectives or outcomes in phase 2. So one is policy advocacy, for example, helping solidify or improve, strengthen land tenure. One is access to markets and business finance. One is helping with climate change mitigation and adaptation, including access, connecting to global climate finance. And one is on improving access and delivery of cultural and social services. And the stuff I'm talking today is specifically about connecting to global climate finance, that particular outcome. And the logic, of course, of strengthening these forest and farm producers is that they're smallholders and they're going to be able to do all these things much better if they're organized. There's a lot of different countries that the FFF is working in, and in all of these countries, there is an apex body, there's a national level FFPO, Forest and Farm Producer Organization, that is kind of organizing things at the whole level, coordinating activities. Depending on the size of the country, in the country there's different levels of subnational ones, and then there are the ones on the ground, the local ones. These are the ones that FFF is really trying to help the activities out, to do all these things, to help the actual people who are growing trees and running farms. And then the other thing is internationally, these apex ones are, that's the national one, that's the same as the apex one here. There also are regional, above the national level, and global level, oops, I'm going the wrong way. And global level FFPOs that are trying to help coordinate the activities of different national level FFPOs. Global climate change finance, again keeping my caveat in mind. Basically there's the UNFCCC, the UN Framework for Climate Change, Convention for Climate Change, and it's the international treaty body that is coordinating the global commitments on climate change. And one of the many things it's doing is coordinating funding for developing countries for climate mitigation and adaptation. And on the mitigation side, for carbon sequestration, but basically it's related to commitments that countries have made to reduce their carbon output. And so there are all these different specific funds, and then they go to the recipient country. So that's just the only broad backdrop we need to for what I'm going to talk about. So to access global climate change funding, the implication here is that the apex FFPOs are going to have to go through this national government body that's connected to the global climate change funds. There's no way around that. And there are a couple of assumptions I want to kind of make that help sort of set the stage for what I'm talking about. One is that these global climate change funds, they need to minimize their transaction costs. These are not very strong assumptions, these are kind of common sense. They are, some of them are controlling very large amounts of money. And the transaction cost is basically the cost of any, associated with any kind of transaction. So in this case, it would be administrative costs. If you want to keep your administrative costs down, you're much better off giving a relatively small number of very big grants rather than a large number of very small grants, because there's administrative costs associated with every grant. So money will always go to the, would go if it actually went. I think, let me back up one little step. One ironic thing here then is that there are real challenges in accessing these funds, partly because the systems are not very transparent, and there's a lot of politics involved, and the only way that these FFPOs are going to be able to access these funds in the first place is if they have strong connections to the national level bodies that are responsible for accessing them. If they were lucky enough to do that, the money will go to the apex FFPOs, and then from there it would go to the local FFPOs. One thing will never happen is that the global climate funds would connect directly to the local FFPOs. The other thing, given that the need to reduce these transaction costs, there's a good, and to keep grants on a more manageable level for the donors, there's a chance that the amount of money that comes to the central FFPO, the apex FFPO, is going to be big relative to what they're used to handling. Another thing is bureaucratic pressures for donors. They call for moving the money rapidly in general. This is kind of common sense, but if you're a donor, your job is to move money. And if you're not moving the money, you're not doing your job. And if you're giving money to a grantee that's not spending it, they're not doing their job either. You're not doing your job yet again. So there can be pressures to make the money move fast in a way that may be faster than these apex FFPOs might be ready to process. So I have three concerns that come out of this backdrop, this situation. And one of them is FFPOs have to be well managed, well organized to manage finance. And I'm talking about the local FFPOs here. Another is that they have to understand the implications of climate mitigation funding. And the third one is that they need to guard against motivation crowding out. I'm going to talk about all three of these. I think the first two must sound like really obvious and common sense, and the third one might be a little unfamiliar, but I'm going to go over all of them anyway. And I'm going to illustrate them with these research projects I worked on in the past. So be well organized to manage finance. Again, as I said, this must sound a little bit obvious, but think about a nascent FFPO at the local level. FFF is helping organize FFPOs. Some of them are pretty well organized already. Some of them are just starting out. The ones that are just starting out, they're trying to organize their members, and one of the things we're trying to help them do is access finance. So the first thing they need to do is manage finance. And managing finance at the group level is obviously very different from at the individual level. You've got different members who are contributing different amounts, maybe expecting different benefits in return. You need to be able to have everybody understand these things, and you need a good accounting system. I think everybody knows, everybody has a personal experience that money can be a sensitive issue. And if you think about it, if you had an FFPO that was gaining access to finance and wasn't ready for it, you could undermine everything you're trying to do regarding trying to organize them. So obviously you need a systematic, transparent accounting system. And this is just kind of speculation. I don't know if people would agree with this, but I wonder if this might be more of a concern with global climate finance than with business finance. I tend to think, again, not knowing anything about FFF's experience in this regard, that businesses are going to be kind of more careful with where they put their money and what they expect to happen with it, and the big donors, and especially given these kinds of pressures I was talking about to basically make the money go. One of the things implicit in what I was saying about that is that I think the pressure to move the money and put the money in place may be greater than the pressure to make sure it gets spent correctly, which is not going to be the same in business finance. So let me just talk about a project I worked on in India, evaluating watershed management projects. This was a big, this is kind of the focal point for rain-fed agricultural development in India. India is a huge country. There's a giant program, and has been for a long time. So I was working on this evaluation when I was with the International Food Policy Research Institute, and it was commissioned by the Government of India and the World Bank. So what watershed projects try to do, especially in particular in this context, what they do anywhere is they try to optimize land use in a watershed. A watershed is an area that drains to a common point. And in India, it's all about protecting in this picture, protecting the uncultivated lands in the hillsides. You want to reduce soil erosion, you want to promote groundwater infiltration. You want to also reduce erosion on the rain-fed agricultural land, and you want to promote groundwater infiltration so you can promote irrigated agriculture in the lowlands. And there's a lot of technical issues involved, and there's also a lot of social issues involved because the benefits and the costs are distributed unevenly throughout the watershed. And so you've got to figure out a way to get everyone on the same page. So if you're evaluating watersheds, you're going to look at these kinds of criteria. How are you doing with reducing soil erosion, with the productivity of the common lands, these uncultivated lands, the productivity of the rain-fed land, and the irrigation development. So we did this big study, 86 different villages, around lots of different households, 2 big states. We did econometric analysis looking at the factors explaining these outcome variables, and we did some qualitative analysis. I'm not going to go into detail on any of these research projects, but a way to think about what we looked at and what we found is there are 3 ways that I can categorize these projects for the purposes of today. One is those that are technology focused, like make sure you get the right kinds of vegetation in place and the best soil and water conservation practices. Another one is more social organization focused. It's like, okay, people know how to do these things. They have local technologies that'll work, but we're going to focus on helping them organize themselves so that they know how to handle all the complex social issues that are going to arise. And then a third one was a combination of the technology and the social organization focus. And of course we looked at controlled villages that didn't have any project. And we were looking at what happened after all these projects had ended, the staff had gone away. And let me just give you a little example of these project approaches. So if you look at the technology-oriented one, this is they versus the one that was combining the technology and social organization. So the first category, they had no project staff with any training in social organization, whereas the other one had like half their staff were focused on that. Next, the first category there, they pre-selected communities, and then they formed groups within those communities for the purpose of managing money to make these projects go. The other ones, they recruited communities only after they had already demonstrated collective action. For example, they had to show that they had already set up systems that would protect common lands against overgrazing, which is tricky because poor people depend on those for their livelihoods. And they also had to show that they had a system in place for voluntary communal labor to do things that are useful for the village. This is a tradition you'll find all over the world, really, and 3 of the projects I'm going to talk about today had cases of this. Another interesting thing is that the technology-oriented program, they hired guards to protect these common lands against overgrazing, whereas the social organization ones, they took advantage of this existing system of voluntary labor to do it. And then, sorry. And then the one category of projects, they started spending money on day 1, whereas the other one said, no, we're going to wait for 18 months, and we're going to help people get organized, and then we're going to start spending money. Which the first category project had it literally would have been impossible for them to do that because they were under guidelines. You have to spend your money, which is why I'm kind of concerned about that, why I raised that concern earlier. So you probably won't be surprised to know that when these projects ended, a lot of stuff just disappeared completely in the first category. It's funny because one of the projects was funded by the World Bank. They still had people coming to visit the projects. And the guards stopped working and nobody volunteered. You know, nobody was raising money, nobody was volunteering. And so they actually came up with some emergency money in these states where this program was working to keep hiring guards so that they could show the visitors that it was still working. So the bottom line up, and you won't be surprised, is that, well, actually the programs that worked best were the ones that had this combination of the technical and social focus. But the social organization was far more than the technology development in determining project success. And organizing these communities to be able to solve these problems and managing funds was crucial. And one interesting thing is the World Bank changed its policies shortly after this, and I don't think it was just because of this project, but in projects all over the world, they started implementing this idea that they're going to organize people for 18 months before they start spending money. Okay, another project I want to talk about is a payment for environmental services program in Mexico, where we're looking at what happens to people's pro-social behavior, their behavior in favor of kind of the common good in the face of financial incentives. And it was in the context of this payment for environmental services project, and we did surveys in a bunch of villages and looked at various things. But what I want to talk about today is we did this field experiment where we invited people in several villages to come for 2 hours and pick up litter from the village. There's a lot of litter in a lot of these villages, and there are traditions of doing something about it. And if anyone wants to know the details of how we did it, I can talk about that later. But we did this in 5 villages, and what's really interesting is the characteristics of these 5 villages in relation to what we found. So I talked about this communal labor. In this part of Mexico, you have that same tradition. And if you look at the differences across the villages, there's one where basically traditions practically died out. They do it once a year. And on the other extreme, you have it where they still do it every week. We looked at the percentage of people from our survey who were familiar with how this payment for environmental services money is spent. Basically, have they ever received funding from it, or do they know anyone who ever has? And you can see that there's a great range, ranging from practically nobody, this is in the village where they also don't do much communal labor, to the vast majority of the people. And then the third was the percentage of respondents in the survey who said that it's common to have a good leader in their village, somebody who's looking after the well-being of the community as opposed to somebody who's just trying to enrich himself. And the same pattern. You can see kind of a common trend across all these things with a couple of outliers. But the places where, you know, the first village, almost nobody thinks it's common to have a good leader, and then the last one, most people do. So what did we find? I forgot to say a very important thing. So we invited people into 3 different categories. 1, we just invited people to come. Will you help clean the village for 2 hours? 2, will you come and help clean the village for 2 hours, which is a quarter of a day, and we'll pay you a quarter of a day's wage. 3, we'll pay a quarter of the day's wage, but we won't pay it to you. We'll pay it to the leadership of the village. That'll be going towards some communal activity. So what did we find? So when you invited people for no pay, you can see the last column is the total. The average is about 25%. A quarter of people said yes, but you can see a sharp pattern that kind of goes along with the previous pattern. And when you offered payment, the participation went up by about a quarter. Similar pattern still, but the part that's really interesting is what happens when you pay to the community instead of to individuals. And you can see that in the places where people don't trust their leaders, where they don't have much, they don't know much about these projects that are going on, the percentage is practically nothing. And in the last one, the percentage is extremely high. And it's because they had no problem working on a communal activity. Everybody's accustomed to it. They're used to, they trust the village. And in these last 2, it's kind of interesting because these were groups that had a community-based forest enterprise. And the way that they operated is that people put their labor voluntarily, not voluntarily, but without payment, to the work of this forest products enterprise, and the way they get paid is through a dividend from the profits of the enterprise. So they're accustomed to doing work where the money goes centrally. So why does this matter? Well, you know, as I was saying earlier, the climate funds are going to go to the FFPO, not to individuals. And so if you have communities where people are not trusting their leaders, that could be a real problem. And again, it requires this functioning, transparent system that works. Okay, the second thing I was talking about was the need to understand climate change mitigation funding. I was commenting earlier that when a country gets climate change mitigation funding, this is linked to their international commitments for reducing net greenhouse gas emissions. So you know, people who know the details about all these different programs are going to be thinking about all the specific details. But generally speaking, there can be an implied contractual commitment associated with this funding. And if FFPO members don't understand how that works, there could be challenges. And I think this is a real problem because I think it's really common that local people don't understand the nature of these kinds of projects. And so I can see 2 kinds of likely outcomes. One, people, and there's documentation of both of these. One is people getting locked into arrangements that they're not really happy to. They commit to a long-term land use, and they don't understand. They're taking the money looks good, they're used to getting money from development projects, and now all of a sudden, oh, I'm locked into this for the long term. That's not what I thought. And the other, of course, is that the project doesn't work and it's not meeting the implied commitments. And so just a little evidence about do participants really understand what projects they're part of, the projects they're part of. And these projects I was working on in this Mexican PES system study, we didn't ask very specifically about do you understand what the project's about, but only 50% kind of gave a general sense that they did. And there was a project I worked on in Indonesia where 80% of the people understood the commitments that what they were supposed to do under this project that was giving them benefits for changing their land use. 80%, well, go with the 80 and skip the 45 for now. And in this Indian watershed projects, only 50 to 70% of people in these technically oriented projects had ever received any technical assistance and really understood what they were supposed to do. And a related point is, do people take project efforts seriously? And I think this is my short answer is don't don't expect that they do. This is a picture of a, if you, I don't know how well you can see this, but there's a little ridge here, and it's from an earthen barrier that a soil and water conservation project installed for the purpose of reducing erosion. And you can tell if you look carefully that it's been plowed over. So why did it get plowed over? Because it was put on somebody's land and they weren't really interested in it. And of course, I think people are familiar with this kind of thing. It happens all the time in top-down projects. But what's very interesting here is it also can happen in the more participatory projects. So in this very village, there was an activity by an NGO to try to say, what kind of program would you like? We want to work with you to help you set up basically a watershed project. What kind of activities make sense for you to get this done? Well, to their surprise, people said, we need more of these earth and soil conservation barriers. The same ones that they plow over, the same ones that we already know from our research they thought were nonsense. They didn't make any sense to them at all. And in probing for a while, separately from this effort to help set up a project, what people want, they don't have any expectation that this project delivered by these outsiders is going to make any sense, but they do know that if they come and build these barriers, they're going to employ a lot of people for quite a bit of time during the dry season, and that's going to be a tangible benefit that they're going to get. And that's pretty much all that they can, that's all they expect. So why does this matter? People have good reasons to not take projects seriously. I think anybody who's been on the ground with this kind of things knows that they're experts at telling outsiders what they want to hear. And this could be a problem, again, with this climate change mitigation funding. If they don't understand what they're getting into, they tell you what you want to hear, and it could be a problem. Okay, last one is about motivation crowding out, so the need to guard against it. So let me just explain this one a little further. So people have different sources of motivation that make us act, right? So we might want to respond to money. We have a financial incentive, we activate toward it. Maybe it's, we do things out of love or friendship. We do things because they make us happy. We do things because we think it's the right thing to do. And so what happens when you introduce a financial incentive? What happens to other sources of motivation? Well, development projects, and specifically payment for environmental services project, and also a basic assumption of economics is that when you introduce a financial incentive, it's going to affect the financial motivation and leave the others untouched. But there's a lot of evidence that that is not the case at all. And I'll give you a couple examples. So for example, motivation crowding out would be that I give you or you give me a financial incentive, it makes me focus on that financial incentive, and it actually undermines some of the other sources of motivation. There are also evidence of motivation crowding in that you can actually stimulate those other sources of motivation too. Those examples are harder to find, but they exist. So why does this matter? Well, financial incentives can have unexpected impacts, and when the funding ends, things won't necessarily return to the way they were before. And that's another thing that projects don't think about, or that economics doesn't assume. It just assumes, if I pay you to do something, you'll do it, and when the payment ends, you'll just go back to whatever you were doing before. But if your other sources of motivation have been undermined, that may not be the case. So just a few examples. This one I just read about very recently. There was an indigenous village in the Colombian Andes where they have, again, the tradition of voluntary communal labor for various things. And there was a program, there was a World Food Program intervention to help poverty alleviation in this place. And they took advantage of the communal labor situation, but they basically paid people to do that work. And once the program ended, a lot of people were no longer interested in participating in what they had done for a while. There is a famous study of locating nuclear waste facilities in Switzerland. And they went around and did surveys. Are you willing to accept a nuclear waste facility on the outskirts of your town? And the majority of people said yes. I said, this is the last thing we want, but it's our civic duty. It's got to be somewhere, so sure. They offered to pay people $4,000 a year to have this community, this facility located there. And the percentage that said yes decreased by half. They offered paying $8,000, it decreased by half again. And the reason is people are saying it's not worth $8,000, and they just totally forgot about the idea of the civic responsibility. Another one is from my own research is about schoolyard maintenance in Tanzania. I had a couple of PhD students working on this at the same time I was in Mexico, and we had exactly the same design. The question was, will you plant trees and clear weeds in the village schoolyard for 2 hours? And some people were just invited to just do it. Some people were given pay for a quarter of a day's wage, and some people were given, the payment was made, but it went to the village. In this case, everybody trusted the village, so there was no concern about that. The other thing, there was a kind of the way it was executed was, there was some screw up, and basically everybody accepted. So what is interesting here is not what percentage of people participated, but how they felt about it afterwards. So in exit surveys afterwards, the people who were not paid, 86 to 90% of them were very happy with the work. And the ones who were paid, they weren't happy at all. And the kinds of comments that came out, people said, oh, you know, it's really great, I got to do this, we did this really useful work for the community, I got to spend the time with my friends, I hope we do this again sometime. And the people who were paid, they're like, man, that was a lot of work for so little money. So these are different examples of the different kinds of motivations that can get undermined if you're not careful. So you want to avoid that. And you have to be prepared for what happens when the money ends, because the money always ends. Okay, so it's well understood that this happens, but there's not a strong theoretical understanding of why. And so it's important to understand why if you want to try to do something about it. So I'm working with some colleagues, one who's an economist, hotshot econometrician, and the other is a communication scientist who studies social norms. And some of the research said, oh, could this be related to social norms? So we're looking at that. So we build this economic model that incorporates this thorough view of social norms. And that's important because in a lot of places, a lot of economics, if you think about social norms, most of us have a vague idea of what it means. And it's often seen as something that's fixed and given. And, it can be more complicated than that, more specific for the people who study them. So there's descriptive norms, that's what we perceive that other people do. And there's injunctive norms, what we perceive that others think we should do. Those are two separate things, often they get lumped together. So we have this kind of model, there's an intervention, like it could be a payment or some kind of technical assistance, and it affects people's decisions and actions, and that affects the ecosystem. And then there's feedback that encourages subsequent actions. And that's kind of the typical project model. But the idea here is that what people do, the decisions and actions that people take, could affect the local social norms, and that could influence subsequent behavior. And the intervention itself, the payment itself, can affect those social norms. And so you have a whole bunch of sets of loops here that are going on that can determine what happens. So the question is, what happens? What are the effects of norms on actions when the payment ends? And so we didn't know, so we wanted to find out. We used an experimental approach. This is really tough to study in the field. So a public good experiment is a situation in which people are asked to choose between contributing something to the common good versus contributing something that is good for them, but at the expense of everybody else. And so the way we do these experiments is you have 3 phases. In the first phase, you ask people to make this decision about doing something that's for the group or for themselves. In the second phase, you give them a financial incentive to do the contribution to the group as a whole. And then the third phase, you take that financial incentive away. And throughout, well, first of all, you can have, in the second phase, you can also have treatments about social norms, trying to influence the social norms. And you can measure social norms throughout the course of these to see how they're changing, to see how they're affected by the previous events, and also how they're affecting the subsequent events. And I can talk about that, how that works for anyone who wants to know. So in this experimental design, we have 4 ways of doing it. There's a control, where basically there's no incentive. You can forget about the financial incentive in phase 2, and there's no social norms treatment in phase 2. There's one with a social norms message, and there's one where they get both treatments in the middle. So the basic experiment, what we found was that people in the payment treatment contributed less after the payment ended. So this is both relative to before they received payment and relative to those who were not paid. And it had to do with the payment undermining the positive effects of norms on behavior, which we could see through these measurements of social norms. This is on campus at Michigan State, and it was a kind of an abstract experiment. We took it to the field. We had a project in Qinghai, China, on the Tibetan Plateau. And the context here is that Tibetan Buddhism is oriented, has a strong conservation ethic. And there's also a history of political repression and of top-down directives that have really screwed up natural resource management, caused overgrazing and things like that. Our context was around wildlife protection. There's a traditional practice of volunteering to protect against illegal hunting, poaching of wildlife. And so we had this hypothetical task. The reason it's hypothetical is the challenge in this kind of research is if you actually introduce financial incentives, you could cause the kind of problem you're trying to prevent. So it was difficult. And the people we were working with, they had that experience. I could have used that as one of my examples where payments had been introduced and it undermined traditional practices. So will people devote up to 7 days in a patrol to remove traps against wild animals in the winter? This is in the winter when they're not doing a whole lot else, and there is a tradition of doing this. And there would be a hypothetical payment for patrolling in the middle of the 3 phases. And there's an injunctive norms message treatment that reminded that people are, that this is something that people are in favor of. So this is how we frame the payment. Imagine the government has agreed to hire one patrol member on an ad hoc monthly basis. Imagine that people in your community who agree to the patrol would be free to select which person becomes the ad hoc employee and also how they want to divide up the payment among them. And another thing implicit here was that you guys get to decide how you're going to do this. And this is different from what they're used to. They're used to the government telling them what to do. And this is like saying, you get to do it. You have this tradition, you know what to do, we'll let you do it, and we'll reward you for it. So the results, we actually found motivation crowding in, so the idea is payment raised the injunctive norm for volunteering, which we were able to measure in the experiment, and that in turn raised the rate of volunteering, and this effect lasted even after the payment ended. So we were actually surprised by this, but the reason that all our local collaborators said is, we framed this payment in a way that appealed to people's identity and to their sense of pride and honor and respect. The government's giving them respect and honoring the traditional approach that they have. Why does this matter? Well, one thing is that although it's possible to set up payments in a way that screw up the existing systems, it's also possible to set them up in a way that strengthens them if you're careful, if you know what you're doing, which is tricky. So I'm just going to throw out a few conclusions about what FFF and FFPOs might do, and I think other people have much better ideas, and hopefully we can discuss some of them. One thing that must be kind of counterintuitive, going back to the beginning, is to help arrange smaller amounts of project money. I know that sounds ridiculous when the biggest challenge is get any money at all. But one thing I was thinking of is maybe to help arrange regional funding instead of national. FFF just this week has RFP out to regional and global FFPOs to do something that can help strengthen the work of national FFPOs. And I was thinking, well, this might be a kind of a good one, is if they could organize themselves, try to work with the try to lobby climate change funds or maybe to some of the regional development banks to think about a regionally oriented project. And something I should have mentioned earlier is that there are a lot of these regionally oriented projects. They're managed through the regional development banks, the African Development Bank, etc. They work in 7 or 8 different countries. And what that means is that the big amount of money that the climate change fund needs to give out is divided over a smaller amount. And so right off the bat, you've got less money. I was thinking of trying to work as a subcontractor. Jose has told me about his work in Guatemala trying to help with the government trying to attract global climate change funding, and instead $38 million or whatever it went to IUCN to do this work, bypass the government completely. But IUCN is going to have a hard time spending all this money. I don't know how much of it's been, and this is just hypothetical, just an example, has been predetermined exactly how they have to spend it. But it could be that, you know, FFF could be doing them a favor by helping them figure out a way to spend part of their money. I can skip that part. Anyway, another one is this encouraging selectivity in allocating funds. Clearly, an FFF's already doing this, working hard on expanding the capacity to manage funds. Could there be indicators of readiness to manage funds? In the watershed project I talk about in India, this group that they would only work with people with communities that already showed the ability to work together. They had some fairly straightforward indicators that they had to meet that they could do. It's funny because I was talking with Marguerite this morning, Benjamin was just telling, one of you was telling me about projects that had all these indicators. And I'm like, oh my God, I better not talk about indicators. But but anyway, and then I thought, well, what about gaining experience working with business first? Global climate change second. I imagine there's a higher bar to entry and greater accountability, and work on that before working on accessing global climate change funds. Coping with lack of understanding, you know, I think this has to be taken seriously. I was thinking maybe adaptation funding could be better to access first than mitigation funding, maybe because it's less abstract, it's less onerous in the sense that it doesn't imply this contractual obligation. Again, these are thrown out ideas, and I expect people in the audience to have a much better sense of how much sense these things make than I do. And group versus individual, this is something kind of interesting. I mentioned the village this is one thing I didn't mention. There was this program I worked on in Indonesia. The benefit was tenure security to people who managed land correctly. They're living in forest areas, and they were illegally there, even though it was their traditional land. And what we found is 20% of the people didn't understand what they were supposed to do, but the leaders of their group said, no, don't worry about it, we can manage that. They don't need to understand what they're doing, they just need to do it. And they don't even understand why they're doing it, they just need to do it, and we can manage that. And so there may be cases where FFPO leadership can handle that, whereas at the same time there might be cases where they cannot. It might be, for example, you're working in community forests, that you don't need everybody to understand exactly why they're doing what they're doing. Maybe there could be indicators of understanding, I don't really know. And then the last one, motivation crowding, taking stock. And drawing on local insights. What kinds of things are already happening in a community that we want to protect and don't want to undermine, and knowing from experience elsewhere that could actually happen. I mentioned the ejido in Mexico that didn't use cash payments for the work they were doing. People just put in voluntary work and then they get paid through a dividend at the end. That worked because it was a community level enterprise based on community land. That's not going to work in all cases. Framing payments constructively. I talked about this Qinghai case. In Mexico, it was pretty interesting. I went to one of the cases where they were recruiting ejidos to participate, these communal management groups to participate in the program. And they talked about, the whole nation is depending on you to do this work to protect these forests. We have this small amount of money. It's not anything that's going to make you rich, but it's just our way of signaling our gratitude, the gratitude of the nation for you to be doing this work. So they're focusing on the non-financial aspects of it, not just the financial ones. That's all I was going to say, and thank you. And I'd love to hear any thoughts about this.
Wouldn't mind being in one of John's classes. It's rare that you see a professor explain these complex things in really quite simple terms. And I like that a lot. And that's one of the very few meetings I've been which has an actual reference list at the end. I kind of was a nice little slide.
Yeah, but I whipped through it.
I know,
It was so
doesn't
small for
matter.
you to see.
It did give us that little bit of rigor, which maybe we're often missing in our, statements. So many interesting topics. Well, I would just open it right up to people to jump in at any different. There's a number of entry points, but overall perspectives, views, some things you think have been missing, or other elements that you think, anything especially that might have stimulated your own thinking about the work we're doing. I obviously have a number of them, but I will wait. And those who came a little late, please introduce yourself, because we have some other guests here as well. Okay, maybe Price and yes, sorry, I'm looking this way, but I'll keep looking.
Thank you, Jeff, and yes, I can be a bit late. My name is Stacy Marish-Banana.
Yes.
I am the team leader for Forest Governance and Economics here in FFPO. And at the moment also in charge for the correspondence and statistics there. And thank you so much for your presentation, because I think you were able to put in a scientific approach some of the conclusions that we inferred from the practice. And it's very clear, I think, that one of the challenges we have related to climate finance is exactly how you move from this very complex and bureaucratic global framework to a local framework. That's the framework that can actually achieve results. And so you touched a number of things, and I would like to highlight just some that for me, also based on my experiences, are very important, and just mentioning that this experience is not only the FAO experience, but I was part of the team that set up the Amazon Fund in Brazil, which was basically the first Back Plus fund in the world. And some of the challenges that we had in that fund is that we spent about 2 or 3 years to be actually able to disperse. And what was the challenge? The challenge was exactly that, even being a national fund, how you can make the communities or the local stakeholders meet the criteria for accessing some bankable or formal organizations requirements, and also how to ensure that you have the results that you need. So one of the experiences that we had was exactly the need of having these local organizations and having even, let's say, subnational or sublocal funds. So the smallest possible unit coordinating the disbursement of these funds, and in a way, and integrating with existing activities, in a way that you're not disrupting the environment, you are emphasizing good practice that were already there. And this is a very, very important point, because usually when you come up with new money, you create some sort of asymmetry, and this asymmetry can disrupt the process in many different ways. One of the things is that it can, for instance, create a new source of attractiveness for leadership in a way that we undermine traditional leadership. So this is one of the problems that we face, and I think somehow it's part of what you mentioned, by how incentives can undermine the traditional way and positive practice. But also, when you bring some funds coming from a new agenda, you might also have an impact on diverting the agenda to other things, and disrupting the existing business and good practice. So I would like to highlight these spectrums on not only working on organization, local organization, forest producer associations, but more than the associations, potentially funds, having organizations that have financial expertise that can actually disperse these funds at this micro-regional level, this very sub-local level, that understand the networks and that can complement these funds with other activities, with other sorts of funds, in a way that it all comes in a basket, rather than creating a new independent source of funding that people cannot perceive as adding up to the business that they are implementing. So it's a way of honoring the tradition, it's a way of honoring the work they are doing, it's a way of creating incentives to the best practice and not creating something completely new that might even have some sort of attractiveness and engagement, but on the other hand might disrupt this social fabric and the other activities that we have there. And also on the climate finance, I think that it's related to that. It's very important of not considering, I think, climate finance in isolation. So if you go to these local level communities speaking only of climate finance, you might bring to them a world that is not there. And you show them in your work that some of them do not even understand why they are receiving this payment for ecosystem services. But they can understand that their activities are contributing to a better rural development, a better and some major benefits for them and for the society. So dealing with climate finance as part of the development strategy, as part of their global benefits, overall benefits, I think it's a very important aspect as well, not at least in isolation. Okay, that was my contribution.
Thanks. Leonard?
My name is Leonard Excel, and I am representing the National Family Forestry Alliance. I really enjoyed your presentation, John, and I really enjoy when we are discussing how local communities and people can manage natural resources, and doing this in a wise way, just in the spirit of Eleanor Roostrom. And evidently money can be very poisonous, but it can also be a driver for multiplying good things happening. And when we, from the family forestry point of view, are looking into the basic principles for an active and positive management of the forest resources, of course we're looking into the land tenure issue, as well as the right to organize yourself in forest and farm producer organizations, to defend yourself in the market. And with these two elements in place, and perhaps also a positive forest service to give you advice on things, then the trees become an asset for the family, for the community, for the village. And the effect is that they plant more trees. That's what we have seen in Kenya, and that's what we have seen in my country, Sweden. We have doubled the amount of forest in the last 100 years, based on this assumption that this is good for my family, this is good for my future, and etc. And that happens to be the best climate action you can think of. If you are able to promote millions of farmers to plant more trees, then you will absorb more carbon dioxide, etc. But as was nice to say here, that was not the prime reasons for doing it. The prime reason is that these trees and these forests constitute an asset for the community or for the family. And we had an event in Kenya with support from the Forest and Farm Facility in the end of March, where we discussed tree planting with Forest and Farm producer organizations in Tanzania and Kenya. The meeting was in the Kenya highlands. And people are planting a lot of trees. And these associations are doing very well. And people are planting and planting without any economic support. So what we wanted to do is to introduce these local driven activities, climate smart, but that was not the main reason for the farmer, to the global climate fund in South Korea, as well as Plan for the Planet. And as also was, as you said, what they said is, this is lovely. We want you to, because the farmers, they could afford to plant half a hectare or maybe an hectare, but with some extra money, they could buy even more plants. So you could just multiply what they already wanted to do. But they said, but we need a partner. And the locals are not partner, even not the local associations are partner. We need someone at the national level to take on board these things to deal with all the administration of reporting and who is spending what and money is going here and there, and etc. And the truth is that in Africa, very few countries, less than the fingers on my hand, has a national body who can have the capacity to do that. But evidently there is money available and money that will not poisoning, but will multiplying very good efforts for climate change, as well as the better livelihood, of course, locally, and many other societal benefits when looking at the 17 SDGs, etc. Thank you.
I don't know whether, I mean, I think, should we keep another,
why not?
a little bit of a round, and then maybe we can have back and forth. Andrew, you have your...
Yeah, I just had a couple of things to say, which kind of builds on other comments. One thing is that you've made very clear is where communities have strong social capital, the communities that function well and so on, that's really an ideal circumstance. That's often not the case in many of the communities. They may have had it in the past, it's broken down for diversity of reasons. So, you know, I'm sort of struck, what are the pathways to rebuilding social capital? I'm sort of struck by component 4 of FFF, for instance, which talks about social and cultural aspects and so on. And it certainly, you know, your remarkably clear thinking would be nice to see applied to some of those questions. You know, how can we rebuild some of that social capital? In some places, you can't go backwards. You've got to go forwards with something else. So, and that may be union organizations, maybe other things that come in to replace what's been lost. Or in some places, you may just go back to individual farmers working on their own rather so much as a community, and that has also some implications for the model. The other question I had is sort of overlaid on this is where does local government fit in? So many of the communities and places where I've worked, one of the big things going on has been decentralization. And there's been an increasing flow of funds to decentralized government. And that can have all sorts of implications. Some of that would be climate finance related. How can that be oriented to lead to the best possible outcomes? Local funds flowing to local governments often end up just being put into road construction and so on, often not well designed, often leading to erosion, all sorts of other problems. So where does that sort of fit in? It's a sort of parallel track to what you've been talking about, but where does local government finance fit in, and how can that be oriented to get better outcomes?
Well, let's just say a couple things. That was, yeah, that's a hard question. I do want to say about having to rebuild social capital. I mean, I think the only thing I could say unequivocally is that it's not something you can buy. And I love this you know, the comments you made about these experiences in different countries, because they're totally on board with what Peter's saying about, you know, about this endogenous development of social capital. And these, I mean, it's a terribly ironic thing that you're describing, because they built this capacity, and this sounds like the kind of situation where they would be able to absorb this kind of funding, but then they don't have any way to do it. And I, you know, worry that if you try to inject that kind of funding early in the process, before people had actually already achieved all this, then it probably wouldn't work. So it's, I don't even know what to say, except that it's a terribly kind of sad situation. I don't know, about what you said about decentralization, my first thought is I imagine that FFF is encountering this and has a practical experience in trying to figure out how to deal with this. I don't really have an answer for that. It'd be interesting to talk about that and think it through. But, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Very interesting and useful presentation. So coming back to the press, actually this is a very important aspect that we could, when we were developing the forestry modules as part of the forestry paper 179, one of the set of questions that we avoided from the whole questionnaire was about press. And we put that as a kind of category of questions, very difficult for people to understand. when we put the question, there's a lot of explanation and things like that. Of course, we put there, but that is a lot of improvement. So I think, eventually that all comes to the money part, you said. We are all measuring this based on the money. And, like Einstein said years ago, we cannot solve all the problems with the same thinking like we created. So basically we think the same way, like how is going to think differently is the question, At the end of the day, this is all about the benefits. People should see some kind of benefit. Yeah, whether it is in money terms or in terms of, in terms of the ecosystem services, or maybe something related to the social and cultural aspects, which actually we forgot in the whole sustainable development dimension to some extent. So basically the point is how we measure that, how we portray to the community that this is socially and culturally relevant. And as you rightly said, many people don't expect money as such, so because they protect the resources because it is something culturally close to them. I can give a good example of missionary communities in India. We would think, I think the first in the way to sacrifice lives for protecting acacia trees in the deserts. Around 350 people died just hugging trees. It was 300 years ago. Even before we started the whole conservation discussions, So I think there are people even today in the world, different parts of the world, who are so committed to conservation and we don't understand what they are up to. This is the issue. We go with a different kind of approach and then we say, oh, this is the right thing. And that is a bit of a problem. And recently, also 10 years ago, I had a bit of research in the Peria Tiger Reserve where I could see how people are volunteering themselves for protecting, managing the protected areas in terms of volunteering, for fire management and things like that. I reclaim that we actually call it as conservation game. So you see that, we are protecting the resource and then people, because of the fascination that somebody is protecting the resource for them, they come voluntarily to protect the resource itself. So that's what we call it conservation game. So I think the issue is that, this all very much depends on the leaders there. And once the leader goes, basically how we manage things, it has to be a bit more institutionalized. That's something which is a bit missing in this whole picture. This is based on basically the individuals who are running the show, especially the forest managers and people like that. And these are some of the comments. So the question I have to you is how we really build the capacity. Of course, I understand you said about managing finance in the communities. And even more than that, how we deliver the project objectives, the communities. How we build the capacity and more importantly, how we retain it, in order to bring even large-scale projects, And this is something that, even we had experiences in the past with the CSOs, they can access the fund somehow, but, implementing the project as such is a bit of a challenge because there are lack of technical capacity and also retention. And the other one is how to manage the conflict. Of course, any intervention will bring the conflict. We have to admit it. But then how we best manage it? This is a question, how we are going to do it.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just say briefly, I think what, the whole model of FFF totally makes sense to me. If you start with the two, the first two objectives, which I understand were the earlier, the objectives of the policy advocacy and the access to business finance, preceded, the 3 and 4 are new ones, is that right, Jeff?
Yeah, expanded for sure.
Yeah.
4 is probably really new.
So to start with organization that is around policy advocacy, including land tenure, and having to organize people around something like that, that's super important to them. That, just working on getting people organized around their own resources towards interests that are important to them, to me is the best way to go. And that's exactly what FFF is trying to do. And the thing about outcome 4, cultural and social and cultural services, which is a kind of a vague term that could be, you maybe can explain further, but I think that these are really important things toward building social capital, as we were talking about. I think back to my experience with the NGOs in India, and the best ones, when they wanted to get people organized, they would start with things that were important to people and using their own resources. So a typical example was helping them build savings groups with their own resources, and once they figured out how they could all save together, then they would think, okay, how can they organize themselves to do things with the money that they put together, do things collectively. And that built financial understanding, it built it built kind of problem solving, it built conflict management. Before they had like somebody else's money coming into the picture. And once they developed that, then these groups would start going to town and knocking on the door of the government saying, why aren't you doing this as you're supposed to be doing this? They'd be going to businesses and saying, we want to take out a loan for the group. You don't have loans for the whole group? That's what we want. And the NGOs started advocating for that on their behalf. And then it started happening. Programs emerged for that kind of thing. So these are all endogenous and without, like somebody coming from outside saying, here's some money, help us spend this money. I think that's super important. And I think that's consistent with the comment we got earlier about how all these people all over Africa were growing trees because it's good for them and they're learning a lot about how to organize themselves in the process. But I don't think you can shortcut that. I think you can undermine that when you start throwing money at people who aren't ready for it.
So, Johnny and then Marco.
So, sorry, John, I missed all of your presentation, but I would want to learn from your thoughts, John. I see, so the world is in front of, no, we are living very complicated challenges. Climate change, food security, which never before happened. So, and people on the ground are suffering these kind of things. We are continue doing the same thing that we have done many years ago. Research on the same thing. To my mind, there are two different worlds. So, this, of course, the university has to provide PhD, has to do research, all these things before. Because the things were not so complicated as now. We could afford to have so many researchers, and at the end of the 40 years of some experience, sorry, would be good to have more money going to the communities. I am remembering one of the conclusions of these 40 years of community forestry. One of the results was, would be good to have more money going to these communities, more than research. So we are continue doing feasibility studies, assessment, expecting that these communities go to our workshops 3 days. So, and at the end, what we could offer is assessment. The universities are continue doing issues that somehow are packages and we have here with other names, old wine, new bottles. So I was last week in Kenya. In Kenya, the last 2-3 months when there's a rainy season was not raining, and we were affording these farmers to stay in our workshop, and they were thinking on their families to, if they would eat something or so. So now you will go back to your university, continue doing your research. We are here, but you have somehow see these two worlds. So we are trying supporting people. I don't know if in the right way. You will go there. If there's some kind of suggestion from you how we could do our job better. I think so. Of course, the research should not be stopped. But the world is needs some more urgent actions. And these people on the ground, they are part of the solution, which is urgent.
It's funny, I laughed because I thought you were going to say, can you suggest ways that you can do your work better because the whole system is screwed up and you're part of it. But I mean, I think you're part of the problems. You're talking about a system that's totally screwed up. I mean, I imagine that these researchers, come in and they're asked to do feasibility studies for a program that's already designed. That this is how it's going to work, and how are we going to make it work better? And I think the whole system is totally screwed up. I think programs that I'll just give you an example of the kind of program that
Thanks for the tweet.
that I think makes way more sense than the way things are normally done. And there's a kind of a new category of development programs that are organized around helping to build capacity of local government, and then giving them freedom to do what they want. And if you think about like a community in the U.S., like where I live, East Lansing, Michigan, it has its own tax base, and it has the ability to gain grants from the U.S. government, and then it decides how it's going to spend its money. You think about a little village in India, they don't have a tax base, and they don't have the ability to decide for themselves what they're going to do. These departments from above come and say, we're going to do this. And in the old days it was, we're going to build a bridge. And they say, we don't need a bridge, we already got a bridge. They say, no, we're the bridge building department. Say, well, we want a schoolhouse. And they go, well, we have money for a bridge, so take it or leave it. And of course they take it because it employs some people. The new model that you see in a few places on more of a pilot basis is you develop these local communities, you give them budgets that they have to figure out how to use with a lot of help, and let them decide, do they want a bridge, do they want a school? And let them decide who they're going to hire to build it. Let the accounts be totally transparent. And this is a totally different kind of thing, because what I was chuckling about when you were describing is you hire these university people to come in and say, how should we build the capacity of these communities so that they can accept this money that we are required to spend on, some kind of whatever. And chances are the structure is set up in a way that's going to screw things up. That's what I think. So I don't have an easy answer to your question, but I do think a kind of radical change in the way things are organized. I think if you had something like that, this kind of situation where you have all these people doing all these good things on their own because it's good for them, let them figure out, how things should go. I could rant about this for a long time, and the solution is not easy because you're going to have, it's kind of like Andrew already said, you've got a lot of wheels already in motion and you can't undo them. You've got to start from a specific point. There's a lot of work needed to build local government capacity. But if the starting point were, help them build that capacity and understand that they're the ones that have to drive us going forward. Things could change.
Maybe we just a couple more. I know I'm conscious of time. Just one quick thought, though, Johnny, to what you're saying. The responsibility is very widely shared. If the academics have been telling us for 40 years that it's important to build social capacity in groups, why did FAO not put into a single indicator in the Sustainable Development Goals anything about groups?
Wow.
Has FAO been listening to any of the research, etc.? Why is there almost no funding for building that social capacity that could manage those funds compared to all the other uses? This is the overall responsibility of the entire system to have ignored. So, it's good for us at least to be continuously reminded, maybe with the same conclusions, but I don't hear those conclusions still being adapted. If 4% of green climate funds has so far gotten to the local level, at least one of our colleagues in the FFD did some assessment, and there's others. No one's listening. So then the question becomes, how do we get people to listen, at least more loudly, as we were sometimes used to be told by operators in India, please listen more loudly. So maybe we need to do that. But maybe a couple of last thoughts?
Yeah, okay. So for me, I will not repeat what's already
Microphone.
because we are I should come.
Just for the recording.
Okay. So I will not repeat what already mentioned because I think we all agree that the social or investing in the social capital is important to make the business not as usual as we are doing it. But you mentioned about the voluntary work and how we can, like most of the community or those groups, sometimes maybe because most of the work they should do linked to the voluntary work. Did you have like any in your research any look to their customary system? Like most of the voluntary works, if it links to their customary system, then it will be not voluntary for them. It's part of their life, part of their ownership, accountability to their resources. And you mentioned a couple of examples of the rangeland management. So one of my experience in Kenya and in East Asia, where we worked with the community in the rangelands on how to improve their land resource management. And they built their voluntary work on their customary system. they did based on their system. And by that charter, they had access to some of adaptation funds from the government, where the local governments trust their capacity, let's say, or their role in having a better management, and some cases were linked to the PES as well. So I think just to add, like looking to the customary system itself is also a way to encourage how communities or like groups can manage, let's say, or access to finance. I think the time can't have like
I'll just say really briefly, I think you were giving an example of the power of paying attention to local people and letting them build on their systems. And the one thing I was thinking about as you were saying is that the one thing we don't want is, outsiders sort of taking advantage of the fact that people have systems that they do voluntarily and deciding we're going to just free ride on them. Sorry.
My question was, if I understand that the second part of the presentation was about how money really influences behavior, and in some way also the balance of things. And you talked a lot about how money affects behaviors and things at the local level. The reflection I wanted to have is that I have seen, since I worked in FAO, also that there might be some small programs which are doing exactly this, building local capacities, social organization, and then the big money comes in from somebody else. And all of a sudden everybody starts running towards the big money, and it completely disrupts all of the good things that you're talking about. And that happens both, one organization crowding out the work of another organization, or even within the national government, when the money starts to get big, one ministry gets put aside and another bigger ministry comes in to play the game. So I don't know if, I was wondering whether you had any reflection for, I know it's a big question, but you talked about what to do at the local level, which is, to strengthen the local capacity, but what about this bigger, game that can happen, at the national or between organizations? That was one question I had, and the other, you reminded me, talking about incentives and local initiatives, about something I've been looking at some time ago, really not doing any serious thinking of, but incentives for learning. And you have many countries, for example, where in order to attend a workshop, you actually have to pay people to show up. And whether you're aware of any research that shows, is this effective? Does this work? It's very interesting that you go to, I worked at the beginning with Johnny a lot in Latin America, and this thing never happened. Farmers would work for a day to show up at the workshop because they thought it was important. The moment I started working in Africa, you could not get anybody around the table unless you put some money there, whether it's through a lunch or through some sitting allowance or whatever. I remain highly skeptical of this practice. I know that many organizations do it, otherwise they don't do any capacity development. But I was wondering if you have come across any interesting thing on this, Does actually financial incentives promote learning or not? So these are my two questions. Thank you.
They're both big questions. I think that the second one you could answer in a little way by doing little experiments to see how things work. But there's a giant system around the world where you pay people to send their kids to school, and the logic is they don't send their kids to school because their kids are valuable when they're not in school. They're working in the fields, so make it economically valuable for them to attend school, and then you will simultaneously help the family in the short term, and in the long term you'll help build their human capital. And there's a lot of different evaluations about how that works out. Yeah, I'm totally share your skepticism. You know, you set up the incentive for people to come for the money. Why would you know? That's going to be on their mind first. I used to work in Egypt for a long time, and in Egypt they were getting tons of money from USAID, and in every office in the government, everybody's big concern was, when were they going to get invited to go to a workshop in the US? So they could have their trip to the US and they could have all the money that was going to come with it on their big. They didn't care what it's about. It had nothing to do with that. So yeah, I totally share your skepticism on that. I think about the the scaling up. I mean the motivation crowding at the big level. And it's about scaling up, and development agencies are obsessed with scaling up. You start something at the small level, you see that it works, and then you expand it 100 times because everyone's looking for something that works. And there is this very flawed logic that because something works at the small scale, it's going to work at the huge scale. And even they do with these randomized controlled trials, and they determine without a doubt that this thing works at this district level. We managed to have all these wonderful outcomes, so therefore we're going to do it at the whole country level. And of course, the kinds of things you described have to happen, that there's concerns within the bureaucracy about how it's going to be organized. There's, you might have had specialized people who had certain skills that could organize the program at the district level, and now you're doing it at the national level. You don't have all those people. You're going to affect the market in certain ways. So you can't assume that the transition is so smooth, and the problems that you described, I think, are inevitable. And it's kind of a problem with the model. But I think I feel like I need to go do some good lit reviews to see what kinds of small, experimental research projects have been done on how people respond to certain kinds of things, and maybe do some new research along those lines. Thank you.
So I know we're really short of time, and we should probably wrap up. And thank John. I just had a couple of very quick thoughts. One is that this first question, which you would think would be a really important one before spending money, is to say, is money the problem? By that I mean from two ways. Did money cause the problem? Global finance is probably the reason we have climate change. One of the main points behind that, let's be quite clear. The whole economic system is based on, that's driven by that. On the other hand, can things be supported that are going on without money? I mean, this hectares of restoration, trying to find any dollar amount. You can restore huge amounts with very little money, and very small areas with a lot that as soon as the project's gone, are gone. No? So how do we balance this and understanding and then where can that? But also, to my mind, there's really this whole issue around payments, which I think your talk was more around payments of different forms than investment. Now we're moving to a whole frame narrative around investments. Investments carry their own set of potential positive and negative. If I become an investor in your property, I own part of your property. I mean, there's a whole different set of arrangements that suddenly come into it. If I'm co-investing in your sawmill, I own part of your sawmill, etc. The relationship has suddenly moved to a different type. It's extremely useful funding, but it might bring a different set of things than the ones around payment that I think you really well addressed. Other question is, there's obviously layers, like you said, in organization, there's nested layers between individual action, collective action, governmental action, etc. These things are fluid, but we tend to see everything as a means to support individual action. We don't see collective action as the ultimate goal. So this is an interesting mindset. We see collectives as a means to channel individual funding. What about collective funding? Funding for collective, which can then be distributed according to the collective. Either for group work, for individuals, whatever it might be, you know, etc. So there's a sort of a barrier a bit in our minds to opening up to a range of different models. And I think I really appreciate your comment about custom. Customary is about a way of living. It's not about willingness to volunteer in a, sorry, but like in a game theory or something. You do it because that's who you are. It's not because it's a choice. It's who you are.
Yeah.
It's not a choice you make.
Right.
So this is a very different thing, and we leave this out of so much of our work because we are so utilitarian, you know? And of course, money is a utilitarian tool from one perspective. But our approach is so utilitarian. Is there a benefit? Is there a, you know, how can we show increase in income, increase in market, increase in... But people's view of life and value is a combination between what we would call utilitarian and what, I don't know, emotional, cultural, spiritual, whatever it might be. How can we be more conscious in a way of blending money more into a combined purpose than utilitarian only somehow? So how can, you know, money help to create a sense of well-being and shared prosperity, not just an individual way to get what you want out of that, etc. The other question is, how do we build capacity for communities or groups to decide where and when they want finance, not how and when they get finance that's out there. So that relates to what you were saying. You know, let them decide. Oh, we can do this on ourselves. No, for that, there's nowhere we're going to be able to pay for the asphalt for a small road, or there are things that you really need capital for. You know, small equipment. This, that, other things we don't need money for that, right? So again, how do we turn that a little bit around in terms of the planning? But I think it's really useful for us, and I appreciate it. I gave some very destructive grants when I was with the Ford Foundation. The Alliance of Workers and Harvesters was a group of mushroom and other forest products harvesters in the Pacific Northwest that was made up of very poor collectors who had limited capacity. And they had a few members that were like foremen, that were the guys who organized the workers a bit more. Guess what? They were Anglos, not Southeast Asians, Hispanic, Native American. As soon as we gave a grant from the Ford Foundation, their entire board had to change. Their staffing had to change because they had to bring in people who could manage finance. Right? And suddenly we messed up the whole I messed up the governance structure of this group. Because we have to, you can't give you money without you being able to tell us how you're going to organize it. You have to report. And it was a long effort. Because when the funding stopped, that Anglo group said, okay, that's it, no more funding, we'll go somewhere else. Governance had broken down. Volunteerism, or whatever you want to call it, was not the primary reason for being part of it. And, you know, to this day, there's limping towards becoming something again. And so this is a very concrete example where the very skills that are necessary can in fact also then change the organization. And so how do we balance this somehow where, you know, traditional, for instance, well, it's a long and really a hard question. Community tourism things that we funded, where I went to a meeting of the Maasai, and the Maasai elders, the only word in Maasai that I could figure out was, break even. Break even. Break even. So then I said, what's the story? Well, the guy they had contracted for the lodge on their property with their volunteer labor to build the lodge, every year told the steering committee, we're not yet breaking even. They said, we're not breaking even, but you built 10 more rooms to the lodge. We're not yet breaking even, but you've upgraded the facilities. No, but that's all part of the business plan. But until we break even, there's no money to share with you. And, you know, so the point being, the traditional elders clearly knew something was wrong, but they were not yet the people, you know, and there were some younger people coming finally who could actually check the guy's finance to see if that lodge manager was doing, you know, the right thing. But I think, how do we get some form of accountability also where you have to bring in this financial management to existing or customary or other patterns of governance also, or respect for each other or those kind of things. So I think it's really an interesting discussion that ties into so many of the big challenges that we have here. And it's not simple, but we see really encouraging examples. I think Leonard didn't mention, and I should stop it. One of the things really which has come out, I think, partly of this meeting there and FFPOs is they're going to do a really good inventory in Kenya of what trees they actually have as a group. And then we're thinking, is there some way to link this with some satellite data which shows how much of the landscape is their footprint on? That can start then looking at climate resilience. That can start saying, whoa, you know, we might look like we're only 20,000 members. What does that mean? 15% of this district, or 50,000, poplar or eucalyptus or whatever it might be there. This then puts you also in the bargaining position, because the other is the power. You didn't talk so much about the power part, but how do you also sort of come to the table? If you have been protecting a forest fruit tree which has been bearing fruit for 80 years, that value of that tree is $1 million. Are you coming as someone who owns $1 million in the forest because of that tree? Or are you coming as a poor villager who wants government funding because you don't have a tangible dollar in your pocketbook? So also, how do we value these other sources of collateral or anything? Anyway, and so many interesting topics. It's really generated also for me a lot of reflection. I think we should do more of these discussions, and everyone here could have contributed, like I got the chance to because I was chair. So thanks so much to all of you for coming, and let's keep discussing these things. They're hard. We're so happy that we have some, our constituency represented here who are actually trying to help, and we can see that we do struggle with how to do this work properly. So thanks everyone. And thanks, John, for giving us the chance. Mark, thank you. You're welcome.